I would say that if timing is everything, then I am really good. I first heard of Suzanne through an article in Paul Sullivan's column. Paul Sullivan writes on Saturdays in the business section of the New York Times. Why I say that I was really good by timing this was this past Saturday there was a Paul Sullivan article really devoted to Suzanne and her work. And I have a copy of it here, and I can send anybody. So there we go. She is Global Head of Research for State Street's Center for Applied Research. She's responsible for research and thought leadership for the investment management industry, and she's presented at over 200 industry conferences. And she's been in the media over 250 times. That's an awful lot. Please welcome Suzanne. Suzanne, can you tell us a little about your background and how you go about research? That's really two questions.
So we're fairly new, about 3.5 years in existence, and it's been pretty successful ever since then. I started off in a sales role and realized that there was this hidden academic in me that was not being fulfilled, a little bit too transactional oriented. Found what I believe very much is my dream job. Getting paid to learn is quite a luxury. So thrilled to have this new opportunity to start up a think tank, and it's been hugely successful. Thanks to Kelly McKenna.
Well, what have been some common behaviors that you see with respect to individuals and their money?
Yeah, so and just to set the stage, before I start peppering you with some of the interesting research findings, we worked on this study that we released today, hot off the press. This was the one that was covered in the New York Times article. It's titled "The Folklore of Finance: How Beliefs and Behaviors Sabotage Success When It Comes to Investing." And so we've been working on this for about 18 months. Very rewarding to be here today with you to share with you some of the results. And we essentially went out there and we collected the views and the opinions of about 3,800 end investors such as yourselves all over the world, as well as financial advisors and investment managers and other professionals. And then we put all that together and then collected a bunch more empirical data. And then we assembled it, and now we're going to share the views. In terms of the findings related to investor behavior, one of the biggest things that we see is when we look at where people are putting their money, there's a lot of anxiety, especially these days and especially since the financial crisis. So we're seeing that investors, if left to their own devices, those investors that may not be working with a financial advisor, they're parking their money in cash. Yeah. That is the single largest contribution where they're putting their money. So 40% represents the average investor's allocation to cash. And that's a big number. If you look before the crisis, the numbers were much lower. So they were less than 25% in cash and even lower than that. So what's happened is, since the financial crisis, investors have become, and I'm sure you see this, right, very leery of the markets. Investors are not trusting the markets with their money. So what feels safe and comfortable is cash. But the problem is that you can only get so far with cash. You may not be able to accumulate enough money to either provide for, say, a retirement or for future generations. What's underneath this is, in behavioral finance, a term that you're probably familiar with called loss aversion. So what is the greatest fear when it comes to investing? And it is losses. The fear of making a bad decision that may result in losses. So there's definitely, this is not irrational behavior, this is actually rational, because we're looking to protect ourselves, right, from the fear of regret, from fear of making losses. And what's interesting is we found a very similar level of anxiety that was present across all demographic and all demographics, so all age groups and all wealth levels, which means that the financial crisis was pretty profound in the psychology of most investors.
Have you found reasons that people don't stay the course? They don't do what their own planning tells them they should do if they want to achieve something in 10 years, but then they act differently?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the more startling statistics is when we asked individual investors to tell us how do they define success. And you would assume that you would define success as achieving your long-term goal, right? That would be success when it comes to investing. However, and Karen, you and I talked about this earlier today, the majority of individual investors and even professional investors, this is where it gets interesting, they do not define success as achieving long-term goals. They define success in very short term. Basically, the ask, outperforming the market, making gains, and having no losses. That's actually not possible. That's not possible. That is mathematically not possible. So you look at this, and professional investors are the same way, right? So we're human, and we tend to focus on comparisons like benchmarks like the S&P 500, right? How is my portfolio doing against the S&P 500? The S&P 500 or the Dow Jones, they are meaningless when it comes to the long-term goal of an investor. And that's because each investor should have its own personal benchmark, essentially. Here I am, point A, I need to get from point A to point B. Point B is the goal, and that is not the S&P 500. So you start to see that, and essentially point B is, how much wealth do I need to accumulate? How much wealth am I drawing down right now? How much wealth do I want to provide for future generations? That's point B. That is nothing, looks nothing like the S&P 500. So we see we're human, and what this is essentially a fancy behavioral finance term. You can use this one at a cocktail party. Hyperbolic discounting. You'll sound really smart. Hyperbolic discounting essentially is a fancy term for instant gratification. It is instantly gratifying to compare your portfolio against an irrelevant benchmark, especially if you're doing well, and to say, wow, look at this, look at my portfolio. But then, of course, the next day or the next year, you're not doing well, and then you feel remorse. So you need to be comparing yourselves against what matters most, which is the long-term goal. And what was most surprising is, you are one of the exceptions to this, we did reach out to financial advisors all over the world, and many of them tend to be more transactional oriented and more short-term in nature, as opposed to longer term. And so what we found is that on average, about 85% of the time, financial advisors give their clients what they want, not what their clients need. And there's a big difference between a want and a need. Since the financial crisis, there's been a lot more money in motion. And I think people, based on our research, people get quite nervous. And so they want to take control and start to question everything, right? Question the relationship, question the trust levels, and all of that with their financial advisor. So there's definitely that element of competition.
I usually tell people it's more like going to a doctor, and we have some doctors in this room, but if you go to a doctor and you show him your arm and there are red bumps and he says, oh my God, your arm's going to fall, you don't want to go to that doctor, right? You want to go to somebody who's objective. They've seen it before, they can figure out what to do. If they don't know that day, they'll get the answer or a good answer. And I think it's the same in choosing your financial professional. If you never saw a down market, why are you there? Or if you know what I mean? Or if he's trying too hard to please you and he's as nervous as you are, and you say, oh my God, my like Lou was on TV and somebody called up and they called into the TV show and they said, well, when's my money going to zero? He didn't even know this person. When's my money going to zero? Lou didn't think the market was ever going to zero. But if he had said, oh my God, it's going to go to zero, and he got excited like the caller got excited, well, that wouldn't be somebody you'd want. You do want somebody objective with a little distance and, and some experience so that they know what this really could mean for a portfolio. How important is financial literacy? How behind are we in this country in terms of financial literacy? And how can we expect people with really busy lives to know how, enough about financial literacy to even be good consumers?
Yeah, and how much should we actually know? We can only expect so much, I guess, of ourselves, right? So to share with you some of the data, these are kind of depressing statistics, quite frankly. Be prepared. And there's a contrast here that I want to bring out. So the last study that we released, titled The Influential Investor, we asked individual investors, folks like yourselves all over the world, males included as well in this research, and we asked individuals to rate their perceived level of investment acumen. So how much do they believe they know when it comes to financial and investing? Mm-hmm. And what was very surprising, again, behavioral finance, there's a term called overconfidence bias, and this is innate to all of us. We think that we're above average at everything. If you look at some researchers, we're above average drivers, we're above average spouses, above average parents, the list goes on and on. So this is nothing unique to investing, but what was surprising to us is that over 2/3 of individual investors rated their level of investment acumen as advanced. 2/3 rated advanced, and we said, don't actually think that's true. So in this study, we decided to test them. So we decided to construct a full-blown financial literacy test, and we administered this test across 16 countries. And we found that in no way are individual investors financially literate. In fact, they scored barely a D-, 61%. Ask you ladies, where do you think the US ranked in a list of 16 countries, including developing and developed countries?
10.
Yes, did you read the research?
No.
Okay, 10, wow. Okay, we need to give her some sort of award because that was impressive. How much can we actually expect individuals to know, right? And the answer is not that much, and we do have and I'm sure if I hadn't mentioned this, Kelly would have, but we do have this financial literacy test that a good next step, if you'd be interested, just out of curiosity, is to test your own and figure out where are the gaps. And then we've got a content module, but then that's what Karen is for and her team, that basically explains, okay, here's the explanation. This is what compounding of interest means. That's a real basic one. Here's the difference between active and passive. And just so that the only ask would be if you can acquire just a baseline level of information so that you know how to ask questions. Right? You need to ask the question. So it's not that you need to know all the answers. It's that you at least have to have a baseline so that you can ask the right questions of Karen and her team, right? So unfortunately, women rank lower than men on financial literacy, but not by much. Not by much, that's right, despite what the males may think about their own financial literacy, but not by much. So there's a gap there, but it's really, so if men, on average, the global average scored 61%. The women on average were in the high 50s, so not that big of a gap.
We found out where women are on the investment knowledge spectrum, but where are they in being actual successful investors?
The three findings here, the first, I'll list them and then I can get into them. The first is that women tend to be longer term investors. Men tend to be shorter term, and this is a really healthy thing that women have naturally working to our advantage. The second is when it comes to attribution, and this is related to confidence as well, but self-attribution, men tend to attribute themselves for when they're successful and they blame others for when they fail. And I'm going to give you some really interesting stories about that in a minute. So self-attribution is the second finding, and then the third is our decision-making process. Men tend to be faster decision makers, women are slower decision makers, but the reason for that is that women tend to look at all available information before making a decision. So women end up making a well-rounded decision in comparison to men who often go with their gut feel. So more detail, in terms of women being long-term investors, our data absolutely bears that out, where men tend to suffer from being distracted by short-termism and the noise of the markets. They suffer more from that fancy term, hyperbolic discounting, instant gratification than women. And I'll see if I can do this justice. Just in the paper over the weekend, I read a fascinating article that had a snippet of an academic study that conducted shock tests. This is going to sound gruesome, but shock tests where they would set aside a group of people in a room. Half were men and half were women. And this is about instant gratification, and they were told that if they could sit patiently and quietly without using their iPhone or any other technological device or make a phone call or anything, they had to sit alone patiently with their thoughts for a full 15 minutes. Or they could choose to get their iPhone and be shocked with an electric shock, like literally shocked. And 75% of men chose to be shocked to get their iPhone. And the women sat patiently with the thoughts. Even with the younger generation, the women who, young kids, Generation Y in particular, who grew up, right? Millennials, exactly. They were much more patient than the men. The numbers were very similar, a little bit higher, but not by much. So there's something inherent in the wiring of the females that we are more patient. We suffer less from instant gratification, and we're much more willing to stay the course and really focus on the long term. The second, self-attribution bias. What's interesting here is we had asked individuals all over the world, as well as professionals, to tell us, about a recent investment that was made, and why were you successful in that case? Very next question, why were you unsuccessful in that case? And I'll give you even the portfolio manager's response to this. True also for individual investors. The men would say, my experience in investing, my analytical abilities, my ability to strip out my emotions from my investment decisions. You see a common word here, the word my. All factors that are internal to them. And then the very next question, not even trying to hide it, we'd say, well, tell us about a time when you were not so successful. And why were you not so successful? Well, markets took a turn for the worse. I blame my advisor. Right? Bad luck. All of these factors that are external to them. And then they went on to tell a very compelling story, right? The power of the narrative with such conviction. They've actually thoroughly convinced themselves that this is the truth. Mind you, and this is unconscious behavior. This is in the level of most people are not aware that they're doing this. When they take credit for when they're successful and they blame others. Now, women, interestingly enough, have the opposite problem, where women do not take enough credit for when we're successful. And we tend to attribute others for when we are successful, right? So we don't take enough credit, we attribute others, and then when we're unsuccessful, we blame ourselves. So that was one of those data sets where it was a complete contrast between the gender. And you can see, men suffer from an overconfidence bias, more confident in their own abilities. Women suffer from an underconfidence. Now, these are averages. Of course, there's differences, depending upon, certain men, certain females, but on average, this tends to be the behavioral tendency. The good thing about women in this front, this leads to the third gender-related finding, which is the way that women process information. So we, as I mentioned, we tend to be slower decision makers. Men are faster. But there's a reason for this. Men are fast because they only take into consideration information that is complementary to their incoming assumption. What that means is they don't even consider. Now you can see this for the males in your personal lives, right? Men, if there's a piece of information that contradicts their incoming assumption, they say, okay, I'm not gonna take that in. I'm gonna put that over here, I'm not gonna take it in. So I'm gonna reaffirm my incoming assumption, and then I'm gonna make a decision based on what happens is, so because women we actually embrace all available inputs. We make a more informed, on average, decision, because we're not just discarding information because we disagree with it, right? We're gonna take all that in, and we tend to be slower, but actually when it comes to decision making, more well-rounded, and much more so in fact than men.
But I wish that there was a way that women could easily become more confident and better informed. Do you have any suggestions in that area?
It is confidence, and we see through all of this research that women can be equally good, if not better, when it comes to investing and investment decisions than men, right? For all of the reasons that I just shared with you. And your question, Karen, is how do we raise the level of confidence? And it starts very early on. So the way to correct this this is something that who am I to stand up here and talk about, but it does begin in the early years, and to recognize and identify confidence issues. I did find that as financial literacy increases, confidence increases, which makes sense, right? So if you feel that you could get that baseline level of information, then you very well may become more confident when it comes to financial decisions and investing. And I can't tell you how refreshing it is to be sitting here in front of a room full of ladies, because it is almost always all men.
Right.
Now, that's just the gender side. It is also dominated by around the same age bracket when it comes to the leadership, 40, 50s. And you stare out there at the sea of professionals who are responsible for the lives of people, right? The financial lives, and you think, where's the diversity here? There's no age diversity, and there's certainly no gender diversity. There's barely, sometimes there can be geographic diversity where the leadership teams could be, coming from different countries, but it's really at the margin, and you wonder, especially when it comes to investing, because diversification is everything when it comes to making healthy decisions. And, it makes us highly suspect of the industry as it exists today. But also, it's a huge opportunity to have a more diverse set of minds, all focused on the same task, right? We end up with a much better outcome as a result. And we're very far away from that, nirvana state right now.
That's why we value Altfest. They have diversity in their investment process. Thank you, Karen. Very good.
That was not planned.
I know, but that's the strength of the firm.
They also have women.
And
very culturally diverse.
And one of the questions we asked is, what is the primary channel from which you get your advice? And we thought it would be financial advisors, but it was media. And part of that is that the media is just, it's all surrounding us, right? We can't, it's nothing the financial advisors even can frankly do about that, right? It's everywhere, right? You've got Jim Cramer, don't even get me started on CNBC, that's, entertaining, but that's about where that ends. And you've got, and then the newspapers and everything, so it's just really hard. It's hard to sort of contain ourselves. It's interesting, for those of you that might be familiar with Nassim Taleb, he wrote The Black Swan, and so what he did when it comes to investing decisions, he thought that the media actually skewed him in a very destructive way to create short-term decisions. So he refused to read the papers or get plugged into the television. I don't know how this guy did it, but he continues to invest that way because he's so fearful of all of those inputs that are going to create more short-termism in his investment decisions. So he basically blocks it all out, and then he makes investment decisions based on what he believes, so he can go against conventional wisdom and against what everyone else out there is pontificating about.
As a retiree, we are frequently told about the safe withdrawal rate, and that we should take our age and subtract it from 100, and that should be the percentage of investments that we have in bonds. Do you subscribe to that?
Yeah, and that's a great example where the title of our paper is The Folklore of Finance. So essentially the stories we tell that are handed down from generation to generation, that is a folklore, and it doesn't work. It's share your view on target date fund in the sense of it's one size fits all, but based on individuals, everyone is an individual person with individual behaviors, individual circumstances, and that set of funds is based on one thing, which is age. It has no consideration for the goal part of why we're accumulating wealth in the first place. And it gets to your point about being skeptical, right? So this is a folklore that's been handed down to generations. A lot of people have bought into it, but there's no grounding in reality for, is that actually an appropriate strategy? It's a simple strategy, which is folklore tends to be a simple, memorable, sticky, right? And then it sticks as conventional wisdom. A lot of times we need to question things like that. We've done a financial literacy test, but the question is, have you done an ethical literacy test? And we haven't, but that is a fascinating idea.
Have you found that investors' behavior, and particularly women's, has changed since the market downturn of 2008?
That's a good question. Yes.
In what way?
So behavior has changed in general, and women's behavior has also changed. So since the financial crisis, I mentioned the cash stats, which just represents the anxiety that people have experienced since the financial crisis. When people lose money, they lose confidence. And so since the financial crisis, the biggest behavior we see is feeling of regret, feeling that they made the wrong decision. They should have done something else with their money instead of leaving it in the markets. And women, now this is where you see the attribution difference, where there is a lot of anxiety in general, but women tend to blame themselves, right? To say, you know what, it was my fault. And even if it was my husband that was making the investment decision, somehow it was my fault that we lost this money in the financial crisis. and men say that it was the market's fault and it wasn't my fault. So you start to see this, dichotomy of behaviors going on. But in general, the biggest behavioral shift is that memories are very long. It's almost similar to when we studied behavioral patterns after the Great Depression. This is very similar, where people you use the word skepticism, right? People are skeptical, they're not trusting anyone or the markets with their money. And that lasted a very long time. It lasted more than 15 years after the Great Depression. We're already, years after the financial crisis of '08, and memories are still very long. So the financial crisis has definitely affected the psychology of investors, and it's caused investors to become much more anxious, following the markets more than they should be, paying more attention to the S&P 500, right? It was like this wake-up call where I probably did something wrong, and for the women they say it's probably my fault, and I need to start to pay more attention, when in fact that's the opposite of what you should be doing.
My last question for today is, can you expand on that recommendation to the women who've come here today to hear you talk on, the one thing you'd like to see them do more of, or ways they can learn to grow?
Yeah, I think so. The recommendation that I gave away the response to before, which is, to have confidence, right? That's the biggest difference that we see between genders. And women actually are able to be as good, if not better, investors than our male counterparts. Sorry for the cameraman here. And I did say as good, if not better. And one thing that is highly encouraging is, in this room, you all have asked such good questions, really, really good questions. And I mean, so thoughtful, and even more so than we spend all of our time with the professional investment community. And your questions are on par with theirs, and I think you need to have faith and confidence in your ability to ask questions. There's no such thing as a naive question, in our view. And if there's anything, if there's a fee, one of the things we do find, women are very challenged, more so than men, to talk about fees and compensation, right? This is all fair game to say, and sorry to put you on the spot, but Karen, how do you get paid? Not what do you make, how do you get paid, right? That's the question. In other words, okay, I'm paying your firm something, but does your firm get all that money? Where else does my money go? Does it go to other money managers? And follow that money, like all of this. And we find that women, in particular, have lack of confidence when it comes to understanding compensation and fees, whereas men will just go straight at it and say, how are you paid? And they'd even say, how much money did you make last year from me? And so I think it really does come to feeling free to ask the type of questions, very thoughtful questions that you asked today, and keep that up. If something just doesn't make sense to you or you don't understand it, then ask. I think a lot of the human tendency is to just say, well, I should trust it. It's in the statement somewhere, and I'm sure I should understand. Like, what does 150 base? What does 1.50% mean? Like, what does that really mean? That's really hard for people to understand, right? That could be like a typical fee structure for a mutual fund, or it could be a fee structure for an advisor relationship. But what does that mean? Just because there's a number there doesn't mean that you really understand in relation to your overall wealth. What does that mean? Right? So just take a look, and I'd say just have enough confidence in the questions, because what I've seen today is very impressive. You ladies are all very impressive. I'm serious.